All right, this conversation is all on the back of the first major polling of the year. One Nation's popularity skyrocketed with you. Australian voters, they're at record numbers. They've abandoned Labor, abandoned the coalition. The numbers are incredible. 21% in one poll, 23 in another, with Pauline Hanson picking up 2 million votes roughly since the last election. 2 million since May. How bad are they going? The coalition and the Labor Party, the two majors. Dear, oh dear. Is this the end of the two-party stronghold? There's a question. Let's break it down with Paul Williams, a political scientist from Griffith University. Hey, Paul, good afternoon. What's your read on this polling? G'day.
G'day, Ben. Look, this is dire news for the major parties, as you say. It's not something that's unexpected. One Nation did better in the federal election in May last year than people thought would happen. The primary vote didn't really go up that much, but they did score 2 extra Senate seats because there's a different voting system for our Senate for the House. And they've really gone from strength to strength since then. Pauline Hanson, fanned the fires a bit and won some popularity, if only in a dramatic sense, when she wore the burqa in the Senate again. And then with the terrible events of Bondi, which you'd already been talking about immigration, problems around immigration just before that. So it was almost like a perfect storm when the tragic events of Bondi happened last December. And it seems like Australia was sort of sitting with bated breath, and I think they've looked at both major parties and found them to be relatively ineffective on things like immigration. Immigration has soared to be a top-tier issue for Australians, not necessarily for racial or ethnic reasons, but simply things like urban congestion, problems with housing, hospital ramping, those sorts of infrastructure issues. I think people are more concerned about than multiculturalism. But anyway you slice it, it's sort of played into One Nation's hands very well. And voters from both the Labor Party and especially the coalition, more from the coalition, but also some ex-Labor voters, what we call soft voters, people who shop around for the vote or swing between the two major parties or outside the two-party system, they have parked their vote, at least for now, with One Nation. And it's also been fueled by there's a lot of very conservative Australians who just haven't warmed to Susan Lee as well. They don't like Anthony Albanese of the Labor Party, and they liked Peter Dutton, but were dreadfully disappointed in Peter Dutton and the coalition's performance in May 2025. And they've been more disappointed in Susan Lee's performance since then. So they go to the next conservative cab off the rank, which is, of course, the high-profile Pauline Hanson.
I know, Paul, you and I have discussed this in the past, and I'm going back a decade here, but now even more so. Are we voting more presidentially? Are we looking at a leader rather than a party in politics? I mean, you just reeled off then about Susan Lee and about Anthony Albanese and Pauline Hanson. We're talking about the leaders rather than their policies, rather than their parties. Is it a presidential almost popularity vote?
It's getting that way, Ben, and you're right to point that out. And so many of us, if you talk to our friends or listen to our friends they often say, "Oh, I'm voting for Alba," or "I'm voting for Dutton," or "I'm voting for Hanson." We do refer to our vote choice in terms of leaders. Leaders have become the de facto embodiment of the party, and that's a relatively new thing. It probably started big time in the 80s. Of course, television's been around in politics since the 60s, but really in the 80s it took off. People started talking about, "I'm going to vote for Hawke," and Bob Hawke himself referred to that. So Hawke became the Labor Party, and John Howard, took a long time for the Liberals to catch up, but Howard became the Liberal Party, and really we've never really looked back since then. So there is a degree of presidentialisation. The good news is it's still only a relatively small minority of Australians who vote only on leadership. You do get people who say things, "Oh, I couldn't vote for this candidate because I don't like their tie," or "I can't vote for that candidate because I don't like the sound of her voice." You do get occasionally people who say that, but most of us, the vast majority of us, still vote on more than one thing, and it's usually around policy packages, party images, party unity, and leadership is just part of that strong or weak leadership, accessible leadership. So, the good news is not too many of us are so superficial only to vote on leadership. Most of us do vote on the big package. But having said that, parties like One Nation do capitalise on leadership. And so, Pauline Hanson is very much the party. I think Pauline Hanson, I've said, is about 98% of One Nation. You take Hanson out and it's, people would struggle to name one other person in One Nation, but we struggle to say anything other than One Nation except Pauline Hanson speaks the mind type of thing. So she is very much the personification of her party, and the party may well struggle when she departs the scene. And that's one of the reasons why last year they changed the name of the party. Listeners might or might not be aware of that. It used to be called Pauline Hanson's One Nation, but at last year they changed it simply to One Nation in order to soften up the transition when Pauline Hanson steps down eventually.
I was going to save this question for later, but let's go there now because you opened up that door. Is that one of the main reasons why Barnaby has been enlisted to come on board, why he's been enticed by One Nation to do that? And what does this polling show? Do you think Pauline may jump out of the safety of the Senate, or is that Barnaby's domain when it comes to the lower house on the back of these numbers?
It's very difficult, I think, for any One Nation candidate, even someone as high profile as Pauline Hanson or Barnaby Joyce, to win a House representative seat because of our preferential voting system. You've got to win 50% of the vote plus one. Of course, you can get that on preferences, but in order to do that, you've got to finish first or second in what is usually a Melbourne Cup field, and it's a pretty hard thing to do. Having said that, if Barnaby Joyce did recontest New England as a One Nation candidate, I think he'd become pretty damn close to winning the seat as a One Nation candidate. But he doesn't want to leave anything to chance. So I think if he heads the New South Wales Senate ticket in 2028, of course he'll win that Senate seat for One Nation. Even if Pauline Hanson stepped down from the Senate and contested, say, a seat like Dixon or Oxley or Longman, one of those, outer struggle street seats around Brisbane, I don't think she'd win it. She'd come damn close, but I don't think she really would. It's nigh on impossible for them to pick up House representative seats, even when they're polling 21, 23% of the primary vote. You've got to remember, and that is a huge vote. You've got to remember that even when people are polling, when a party's polling 23% of the vote, that still means 77% of the population don't want it. So it's a big ask to go from 23 to 50% plus one. So no, I don't think that was the primary reason for pre-select or securing Barnaby Joyce. Look, he may well be the future. I think Pauline Hanson may be, maybe positioning her own daughter, Lee Hanson, who was the Senate candidate in Tasmania, and she came dreadfully close to winning. I didn't give her much chance at all, but she almost came very close to toppling Jackie Lambie, and Jackie Lambie's extremely popular in Tasmania. Yeah. So if Pauline's daughter can do that at the first election, goodness me, she would almost certainly become a senator in her own right at some point, and I can see them. I can see the Hanson name continuing to rule One Nation in the future. So, but I think Barnaby Joyce is being captured by One Nation in the short term is simply to give it credibility. It's one thing when a backbencher jumps ship, but it's quite another when a former party leader jumps ship. It's up there with Cheryl. People might remember Cheryl Kern jumped from Democrats to Labor. That gives huge gravitas. Pauline Hanson can say, and quite rightly, look, we're no longer a fringe outfit. Major players are now coming to us.
A former Deputy Prime Minister as well, Paul. I mean, he was in charge at one stage. Yeah.
Absolutely. He was an acting Prime Minister. That's right. And, he was a mainstream player. And again, Barnaby said at the time, and I think he's right, that he probably was always more at home at One Nation. He just took him 20 years to realise it, because he was always on the very conservative side of the National Party. He was always an old Nat, not a new Nat. He believes in things like tariffs, etc., which is old country party thinking. And that's where the One Nation Party came from. The One Nation Party resembles more of a old Labor Party from the 1950s and an old country party from the 1930s than does any other party. And that's where One Nation's, so you've got old farmers, old miners, who and a younger generation of people who feel that disenfranchised. And of course, you've got a middle class or a lower middle class. This is a big point too, that, we've talked about inflation since the end of COVID. And, the Reserve Bank tells us, and the inflation genie is back in the bottle. But when you get people at the checkout still paying $330 for a couple of bags of groceries they can carry to the car, they realise that, hang on, there are two Australias here. Neither the Labor Party nor the Coalition is doing anything about the cost of living. People get really cheesed off, and then they jump out of the two-party system and they go to the minor parties.
Paul, outstanding as always. Appreciate your time this afternoon, letting us pick your brains. Paul Williams, the political scientist from Griffith University. He makes some interesting points there. And look, there's got to be some volatility around these numbers as well. This is coming off the back of Bondi. It wasn't off the back of the Prime Minister's Royal Commission. Like that hadn't happened yet. So, yeah, there's going to be some angst. But you're right, cost of living, immigration, right there. Right there. Who's doing what to tackle that?